Welcome and thank you for joining today. The title of today's webinar is Streamline PeopleSoft Provisioning and Gain Process Efficiency. Our presenter today is Greg Wendt, who will introduce himself in just a moment. My name is Stephanie Anderson. I'm the Global Webinar Manager here at Pathlock. Before we go any further, let me just go over a few housekeeping items. If you have any audio issues during this webinar, click on Preferences and then Audio. From there, you can check to see if you're using the appropriate audio device. You can also click on the play sound to check if you can hear the sound coming from your speakers. This presentation will take approximately 45 minutes. There will be a Q&A session following the presentation, so please type any questions into the Q&A chat box for Greg to answer at the end of the event. And to prevent background noise, everyone is on mute. With that, I'll turn the time over to Greg.
Ernie, thank you. So what we wanted, I'm going to do a brief intro of myself and also Pathlock, and then I'll jump into the topic of today. So I myself, Greg Wendt, I'm an executive director here at Pathlock. I have been with the Pathlock team since the merge. Obviously, before that, I was with the Apsian team with both Gray Heller and Apsian. So I've been in and around this technology for the last 2 years, but also with some of our other technologies before for the last 8.5. So before that, I was actually an enterprise architect of different PeopleSoft systems. So I worked in oil and gas, retail, higher ed, for example. So I go all the way back to PeopleSoft version 5 from a support implementation and configuration. I worked with all of the 9.2 systems before leaving one of my last organizations. So I've been in and around PeopleSoft for a really long time. And I think it's really awesome with some of the things of what we're able to do now with the extensions of what the merging and bringing together of all the resources of Pathlock really allows us to do. So now with Pathlock, we really have access to 100+ integrations, and it allows us to provide a 360-degree view across of risk across all of the different applications. And we'll kind of go into that today, and you'll see it. But it's things like SOD and how do you manage risks and how do you keep compliant across all of these different systems when they are so different. When you talk about cross applications, for example, you could be dealing with anything from Active Directory to PeopleSoft to Salesforce to financials and HCM, a combination of all of these different applications. So when you're looking at that, it becomes very difficult to, one, resolve SOD in a single application, but more or less try to do that across multiple in a single view and page. So we can also automate user access reviews, provisioning and deprovisioning, which you're going to see quite a bit of that today when I get into the demos. But you can also strengthen your security by integrating with IAM solutions, whether that's via SSO, single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, integrating with whatever provider you happen to be working with there. But then when you talk about SODs and risks and understanding what's happening inside of your environments, it's really comes down to being able to monitor the user activities, because that's what's going to show and tell you really what your risks are. And that's what we're able to do here. So at Pathlock, we help prove the compliance that your organization is doing through auto-generated on-demand reports that help answer all of those questions for you. So a little bit of some of our customers and some of our partners, but you can see that we're a market-leading controls automation platform, and you're going to see some of that today. So when you look at some of the events and the business activities over there, I'm not going to go into all of the numbers. You guys can see all that for yourself, but that's just a little bit about Pathlock and myself and who I am. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we talk about the remediation costs and what's occurring inside of the organizations out there, some of the threats that we're being faced with, insider threats are always increasing. It's always an interesting track if you look at like the Verizon data breach report or something like that, for example, to see the bouncing back and forth between internal and external threats. So you can see the numbers have increased globally by 44% since from 20 to 22. Also, there are more than 34% of businesses worldwide were affected by insider threats each year. So it's a large number to begin with. And when you think about insider threats, automation and controls are one of the real ways to help mitigate a lot of those risks. 2 million average yearly cost and fines and penalties due to non-compliance. So you have the insider threats, you also have compliance issues that you've got to work with. And then, security events. What happens when your organization has an issue, say a ransomware attack, or somebody goes in and they do fall for a phishing attack and you don't know what's happening inside of the organization? I was at a conference presenting one day and we were just kind of talking about a phishing attack, and the end user, for example, they're going to go in, reset their passwords, the security group is, and then they're going to basically give access back to that user. So they might be inconvenienced for 10, 15, 20 minutes, maybe an hour, maybe a couple hours if it's really bad. But that's just the tip of the iceberg as to what has to happen. Now somebody has to go through and analyze all of the access that was performed when that account could have been compromised or was compromised. Was that a 10-day period, a 5-day period? Was it a couple of weeks? Was it a couple of months? Or was it only a couple of hours? That you have to go back and analyze all of those different events and transactions that user might have performed, or data that user may have accessed inside of the system. Because without understanding what they viewed and what they did, it's going to be very difficult to understand whether or not you need to come in and provide credit monitoring, or if there was any sort of a breach. So it's one of the issues when you're really talking about compliance, audit, incident response. All of those things are blended very closely together, and how you mitigate and manage all of those risks. When we talk about the previous ways to manage risk, and a lot of groups are still doing this because I talk to them on a daily basis, but it's one of those things where there's a manual process. Let's talk about a new hire, or even somebody changing jobs. Somebody's going to come through and we're hiring this person. What are we hiring them for? If it's going to be somebody who's going to be a high privileged user access inside of the system, all right, well, they're going to get hired. Then we're going to go through, once they get here, they fill out all of their information, they get a computer, there's going to be manual processes, they're going to take time. Okay, well, let's copy this role and that role, or this person's access, and give them those types of access. And we have to do that through all of the different applications that they need access to. So there's multitude of stakeholders that are getting involved, and there's a lot of tedious reviews that have to happen, or maybe they don't. Typically they'll come in at the end with an audit review. I've talked to some organizations and it's like, oh yeah, I still have access today from the very first time that I joined the organization, when I was in a different group, maybe HR or payroll or financials, and now they're a tech person, but they still have that same access from when they started. That's obviously not auditing and removing the access that needs to take place. So that slow onboarding process affects your organization, because it may take, from once that user gets on board, it could be 2 to 3 weeks to a month before they're actually really productive inside of the organization, which, it causes issues, and it causes the organization money, ultimately, because you're paying this person to sit around and not do anything. And it's also tying up a lot of other users, because they're going to become unproductive, because the new employee is going to start asking questions. Well, I don't have access, I can't see that. So then you're going to go back and forth and, okay, well, give them access to this or give them access to that. So that's where there's a lot of human error involved. Sometimes they end up with higher permissions than they really should have had in the first place, which is common as well. But it really misaligns all of the resources that your organization needs to bring to bear on the topic. It's tying up a lot of people in trying to fix a problem that really shouldn't be a challenge or a problem in the first place, especially when you're dealing with automation. So, manual provisioning process challenges, when we think about that, it really is time consuming. That onboarding, offboarding, how do you offboard? It becomes a very challenging question, depending upon the employee. Are you providing your own, W-2s, W-4s, tax-related information? How long do they have an account? When do we expire them? When do we kick them out? Are they contractors? All these other types of things. All of those questions deal and jump into that whole onboarding, offboarding process. So it becomes very time-consuming, and I think the offboarding can be even more time-consuming than the onboarding of the new employees. It's typically a very siloed process. A lot of the groups don't talk to each other, whether it's Salesforce or IT or business users. So when you're talking about when that event occurs, how long does it need to take place? What type of access did they have in all of these different systems? What about your dev test stage, track and all of those types of systems that they may have had access to as well? So those siloed processes don't help to understand what this user may have had access to or what they need access to when you're manually provisioning them. Also, many people are involved. You've got the requesters, users, reviewers, approvers, lots of touch points, and then you also have the people who are going to be doing the access, in the security group, whether that's, and that goes back to the siloed processes. You're going to have somebody who's probably on the IT side, and then you're going to have somebody who's on your business app side. So you could have a PeopleSoft security administrator, an AD administrator, all sorts of different security administrators that are having to grant different access throughout the organization for this particular user. And often not, when it comes down to it, the user access reviews and manual provisioning is just a rubber stamp by the managers, because they really don't know what that user has access to. They also don't know what the user is using within the system, which becomes another challenge. They may have all these roles that they're not actually even touching or working with. And that's really a challenge of no centralized platform to manage access and roles across all of those multiple applications, which comes back to that multi-application cross application reviews and access and things like that. So we here at PathLock really have a unique governance approach that focuses on the data security. So one of the things that we are able to do is really have fine-grained access analysis and provisioning, and you'll see that today. We do that through 140 plus business applications, because we have different touch points into all of those. We can also see deep transactions and have that inspection of the did do, and I'll go into that a little bit more in just a second. But there's a big difference between did they do something and can they do something. But as I said, I'll cover a little bit more on that in just a second. But it's also about quantifying the risk and the SOD. So are you dealing with a business process risk? Are you dealing with really an SOD violation? What are we working with? So some of the other providers, for example, they might be able to do the can do, but they can't do the did do. So it becomes a difference of what we're able to bring to bear to solve these problems inside of the applications and for your end users. We're also integrated directly into the systems, so we can provide dynamic access. And that's very different than a lot of our other IGA providers there. They lack the provisioning capabilities that are within the system and tightly coupled to the systems. But we also have a centralized policy management across the access transactions and preventative controls. So that central policy really allows you to control multiple pieces from a single point, even though it might be affecting multiple different applications on the back end. So a lot of the other IGA providers don't have that centralized management and the policies across all of the different platforms. So when we talk about securing your users and applications and data, and how do you prove that to the world? Because that's really what your audits do. If you boil down what an audit is really coming in and validating that you're doing the steps that you're supposed to be doing. And if not, you get a red flag on the audit, and you've got to go back and fix those things. So you either do that through, some sort of testing, some sort of sample grouping, all of those types of scenarios. So one of the ways that we're able to help with this is really through a real-time connection. So we can connect to the applications. We can pull data from your ERP. We can also talk to the cloud, any legacy, all those types of things. So we have touch points to be able to pull all of those together. When we talk about the can do, This is looking at your roles and understanding the access that a user actually has, and being able to put and understand that in terminology around risks and things like that. So it's around governing that user access and the user access review processes, and automating that, so it becomes very easy for you as an organization moving forward from that perspective. Um, when we talk about the did do is the difference now of monitoring the business transactions. So now that's where it comes back to allow you to know, hey, this user, Sally or Jimmy, whoever it wants to be, can do these things. And maybe if they could, can do them, it would cause an SOD style violation inside of the application. Well, did they ever do that? That's one of the questions to sometimes ask as well. So maybe, yes, we have a risk there, but did anybody perform the risk? Now it's a yes or no type of scenario, and that goes into business processes or SOD or your IT controls, those types of things. So it's really being able to close that gap to make you understand as an organization what challenges you do have because of the way maybe your roles are defined, but did you end up with a risk or some sort of violation because of that user having the ability to do those functions? So that's really the difference between can do and did do. When we talk about quantifying risks, this is really about prioritizing the impact. So let's say that you have two different risks, for example, SOD risks, and we'll just kind of put them into, perspective. You might have one that could be a couple $100,000 to where somebody is doing something and it's really costing the organization hundreds of thousands of dollars every time that risk occurs. Or it could be a simple risk that happens, 100 times a day, but it's not costing the organization anything. There isn't, a financial penalty or cost to it. Which risk am I going to worry about first? Well, obviously, I'm going to worry about the one that's got the largest financial hit to the organization, to save money and those types of things, or fraud. So that's where you really need to understand how to quantify the risks and what's happening. And we do this all of the time. So we have connections into the system to integrate and make all of these things talk, and really present it in a way that allows you to understand what's going on in the system. When we talk about automating the user lifecycle, there's a lot of process flow that goes into this. And it really starts with role design. Your roles have got to be clean, they've got to be functional, and they've got to be direct. Some of the things that become a challenge with roles, for example, is thinking about them from the perspective of how do they work. When you're looking at a role, you can have very tactical roles, and let's think about a cross application design here. When you're talking about a single point in time application, you can have a very targeted role. So let's say maybe HR, financials, and PeopleSoft, they're going to be able to do expenses, or they're going to be able to approve expenses. It can be very tactical. But now let's think about what a role may look like if they are doing something like, I'm a payroll manager or I'm an accounts payable manager. Now, what do I need to have there to do my job? That changes drastically because you may need far other applications outside, now all of a sudden, rather than just needing financials, you need HCM. What do you need inside of HCM? Now I need manager, I need manager self-service, I need access to all of these different things. So what you can actually do is you can group those roles together to be more of a business role. And that business role would allow you to say, Sally or Jimmy has access in financials, they have HCM, they have Salesforce, they have need for all of these different things, and you group that together. So now you can holistically look at it and say, oh, they have all of these things. That gets rid of those siloed effects when you look at it more from a business role design, rather than just a tactical role of, oh, Sally has access to financials for expenses. I don't know what else they have. I have no idea. So that's really some of the differences between how you can develop and design these roles to really make it more practical to understand really what is the risk of this particular user, because you'll have that combined look of that understanding, which And that drives into the provisioning and deprovisioning. So now when you think about how am I going to provision or deprovision, especially if you're utilizing more of that business role, is it's going to allow you to say, oh, this user, if I'm hiring them in, for example, they need Active Directory, Salesforce, financials, HCM. It becomes easy to understand what they need access to. And it's, the communication is easier. You can also automate it, and it just becomes more streamlined all the way across the board. It also helps when you have your movers, because really when you're talking about provisioning, you have your joiners, which are new hires, you have movers, which are people who are moving between different jobs in the organization, and then you have your leavers that have left. What happens when you have each one of those different groups and the provisioning and deprovisioning? How quickly do you take away access? On a mover, it might be, well, let's have a 2-week window so they can have access to both of them for 2 weeks, and then it's going to be turned off. That can all be automated. Maybe it's instantaneous, but that you can define that. You can build that into the custom workflows or into your workflows. So access requests, managing of those access requests compliantly. Where do they all come from? There could be automated requests, there's self-service requests, there's requests from a manager, could be high privileged access requests. Each one of those could have an entire different workflow as to what needs to happen with them and track them. And who's going to approve all of those? So you can have an access request that's maybe just completely automated from a workflow process to where, we just hired this user. We see that in PeopleSoft, for example. Well, now we're going to go out and provision X, Y, and Z for them. Employee self-service, simple. That they need that when they're an employee now. Does that really need to be approved? Probably not. Is it, something in the situation where you're giving them high privileged access? No, it's not. It is simple access to their information. So they can go in, update their information when they get on board and have whatever they need, update banking, address, whatever. Very simplistic. That type of request is the easiest to automate and really have up and running. And now there's other requests that can come through. Maybe that user requests information or requests access themselves, or it comes through their manager or something like that. So, and that then leads into the user access reviews. When you're talking specifically about user access reviews, typically there'll be different process flows for this as well. And it comes down to how are those managed today? Talk to a lot of people. Those are still manually done, whether they're done in spreadsheets. Somebody will go through and say, okay, here is all of yours that you have to go in and approve. Very manual processes, which doesn't make anybody want to do a user access review. It's something that we can come in and completely automate the workflow, redirect those to the managers, have an approval process. If they no longer need access, that can be removed immediately then and all automated. So it doesn't have to go through all of these different steps. Different organizations, for example, may do user access reviews on self-service users or low privileged every 6 months, maybe a year. But then when you're talking about high privileged access, that could be every 3 months, every 6 months. I've actually talked to some organizations here lately who are pushing that into monthly. Monthly user access reviews for high privileged users. If you don't have an automated way to do that, it's going to be extremely time consuming and nobody's going to want to do it. SOD audits, the sample testing, and the violation management. I kind of talk about all of those together because it really comes down to the effect of, how do you do sample testing for SOD? Are you even doing SOD audits? Are you doing checks? Your sample testing, what are you even looking at? Your violation management, what happens when there is a violation? Are you putting in any sort of mitigations or controls? What are your options there? So those become very challenging, and really all of those should be built into your role design so that your roles are not handing out controls that are going to get your organization in trouble from the perspective of, oh, we're actually handing out roles that are allowing an SOD violation and we're not auditing those. Clean up those roles on the front side to where they're not doing that. So that way you're protected from that. And then when you go in and through the risk or through the access requests, then you can decide when users need access to certain functionality. That's when you can compare that risk of what that role is going to provide them and see if it's actually causing any sort of violation. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump into a demo here. So I'm going to pop into Chrome here real quick. And actually, let me go over to Safari. I'll start there. So I'm going to sign into a PeopleSoft system. And let's start with, I'm going to start with provisioning and deprovisioning. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a particular user. So I'm going to go out to my recently viewed and I'm going to open up a user profile. That user profile is going to just be an example here. So I'm going to open up this PTDT test basically, and I'm going to look at the roles that this particular user has. So they currently have the AG Composer role, which is provided for them based upon the job function that they actually have. So when we talk about provisioning and deprovisioning, one of the scenarios that we, can automate is really around that mover. So what I'm going to do is go in and change this person's job to where they're going to need different permissions. And then I'm going to jump out and talk a little bit more about some of the functionality there. So I'm going to go in now and let's look at their job data information. So let's go back over here, go to job data, and I'm going to pull open this employee. So as I look at this particular user, I'm keying this. You can key it on basically whatever you want, but I'm looking at the department. So depending upon the department that this employee works for, that's what's going to change their access inside of the system. And you'll see when I get in and show you this, it's going to be cross application access that we're working with. So I'm going to go ahead and pop in a new row here. Let's go ahead and we'll just change the effective date to yesterday. I'm going to go ahead and change their department to 9410, which is research. So this user, from a business perspective, I am just a normal user, PeopleSoft user, going in and making my changes for this employee within the PeopleSoft system. That's all I'm doing at this particular point. I'm not, there's nothing special going on. So this is all in my normal job flow. So from that perspective, let's go ahead and pop down here and we'll save this real quick. Make sure that saves, and yes, we got that saved. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop back to Chrome here real quick, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a process, and I'm going to go ahead and kick this process off real quick. Our PathLock system, this side of it sits outside of the PeopleSoft system, so this is a different external it's not PeopleSoft, but it's a system external to PeopleSoft. And what it's currently doing right now is running a synchronization process. That process is going to look to see certain information inside of the system. So this can be scheduled to run, couple times a day, maybe once a day, completely configurable for your organization, how often you want this to run. But one of the things that we do is we store information about the person. So not just like their roles and permissions and things like that, but maybe like what department they're within. So, or job code, things like that, that help identify what this particular user is in the system, what they mean to us. So as this process is running, what it's doing is it's looking at the changes that have occurred inside of the PeopleSoft system based upon organizational structure, the department code, or in this case, it's changing their department. So as that department changed, it's going to find that, and it's also going to see then that we have generated and created a workflow process, and that workflow process has certain steps that allow me to go through and define what I want to occur after finding an event that matches this nature. So we'll give that just a minute to run. So what the workflow does, and I'll show it to you here in just a second, but it allows you to configure the process and workflow as to what you want to happen with this particular event. So I'm going to pop open the workflow requests here so you can see that I've got a couple. So I am just going to refresh the screen here so we can see. All right, you can see here that I've got a couple of different requests that are approved and one of them that's in progress. We can see that it's waiting on department changes. And I'm at an approval step. So I'm also in progress. But one of the other things that we can see is the risk involved with this. So this is where we're actually taking and comparing this to our SOD rules that are defined for this PeopleSoft system to see if there's any risks associated with this role that's being automatically, or if it's approved, can be automatically applied. So in this scenario, there's no SOD style risks that are tied into this particular transaction or this particular role. So as I click that request ID, what we're going to be able to see is gathering information about what's occurring. And this is showing a little bit of the workflow, not all of the workflow yet, but a little bit of it. So it's going to give me information on who the employee is, what their title is, what group they got moved into, also what their username is, what the request type is, what's happening to this particular user. There aren't any file attachments that are needed for this. You can see that I've also got an approve and decline up in the upper right hand corner, so I can immediately change anything that I need to do with that particular user. But when we're looking at the role mapping, so this is where think about what I was talking about earlier with the definition of more of a business versus tactical role. So what we've done here is for this user now, they currently will add Active Directory. So they're going to be changing security within Active Directory, and they're also going to get different access inside of the PeopleSoft system. And that's all based upon that new business role that they're going to have. You can see a little bit of the workflow down here. So the workflow started, and one of the first things that I have in that workflow is an approval step, just because it's something from a example. Sometimes there's two different workflows. I've had that discussion with customers. Let's say this is a high privileged role. Maybe it's got to go to their manager first or security administrator first. But in one organization that I talked to, the CIO wanted it, or the CISO wanted it. If it's truly a high privileged person, I want to be able to approve that information. So as I go through, I'm going to say approve or decline. I'm just going to say GW approved to be able to go through the step. As soon as I hit this, what you're going to see is it's now going to go through the next steps within these processes. So what's occurring now is it's finishing the rest of the workflow, which I'll pop back over to that screen in just a second to allow you to see. So we've finished up that workflow. So I'm going to reload this page here real quick. So we're going to see that it's going to move from in progress to approved. So now as I dive in and look at that particular request, what we're going to be able to see is what all occurred. So we removed all the roles from that user in Active Directory. We also removed the roles from the PeopleSoft system, and then we granted back additional authorizations inside of Active Directory, and we also added in a new role mapping inside of the PeopleSoft system, all systematically. So there's a workflow to this. There's an audit trail to it that all already occurred inside of the PeopleSoft system as well, inside of Active Directory. So you don't have to go in and perform any extra steps. Basically, upon the approval of that workflow, everything happened automatically for us at that particular point. We have our audit flow, and all of these things are stored together. So you can see when the workflow started, who was approved by, what it was waiting for, and when all of date time stamps of all of those things, the comment that was made in there. So you instantly have all of the auditability around any of those things. That can be done with hiring, firing, the joiner, leaver, mover process. All of those things can be done with around that. So if I go back to the PeopleSoft system here real quick, what I'm going to do is let's go back to the user profile here real quick. And what I want to open up is that same user here. And what we're going to see is if I look at the role, they now have a different role. So that user has changed from where they were before to having a new role now. And all of that was based upon their change in that department code. So very streamlined, efficient, easy to set up and utilize. So it allows the automation really to save you time, energy, and effort, but also make it far more consistent. One of the challenges that many organizations have with that and going through that particular process, though, is also the ability of understanding what am I really gaining or giving this user access to. So I'm actually going to open up one of our portal pages. So this is within the same PathLock system, but what this does is it allows me to look at multiple different steps. So if I were to go back to the life cycle, of what that what user life cycle looks like, it's role design, it's provisioning, deprovisioning, user requests, any of those types of things. How do I set up? How do I manage? How do I work with all of those different things? SOD, validations, going through all of those different steps. So one of the things that we have gone through and delivered is we have default SOD rule sets that we can deliver. Obviously, these are going to be default. Are they going to have to be tweaked or changed inside of your organization? Probably, because you're going to do things a little bit differently, or those types of things than what all the other organizations are going to do. But we have those inside of the system, and basically based upon those SOD violations, we can do all sorts of different things. So let's start with provisioning access. So one of the questions on there. So if I'm going to provision access, there's a couple of different things that I might look at. One is an access request. That access request, it goes through. Once again, when you're talking about an access request and having a centralized system, now everything's together. So it's tied in for approvals, the correct workflow. Where is this process going to do? So you can see that I can request for which system. So we have multiple different systems, and that's when we talk about the PeopleSoft system or one of the other systems. I can select PeopleSoft here. I can request a username. We can copy. We can put all the information in. We can select the roles that they're going to get. We also have a role advisor. We can copy from a user ID over to the other one. All really easy, streamlined, all that other type of stuff. Comments, request, once you're done, you can submit it. So that's the new user access becomes very easy. You can also see the reviews of that, see if they've been done, how many are outstanding, those types of things. So it allows you to really piecemeal all of that together within a consistent workflow. When we talk about provisioning access across multiple different systems, a little bit different, but basically the same thing. One of the main differences here is when you look at the request for systems. So you might be looking at Active Directory, the authorizations. You can add in additional systems, for example. So which system am I looking at when I'm talking about adding authorizations? I can add in multiple. So I can give roles inside of Active Directory. I can give roles inside of Google Suite, PeopleSoft, Salesforce. All of those is just as an example, and you can tie all of those together. So that way you can look at it holistically in one particular piece of this particular user is getting these 5 things. So from an authorization, I can perform all of those requests. I can get all the approvals in one spot, and I can have all of that controlled. So, that is one of the key points in dealing with that user lifecycle management is, all right, how do I deal with those user requests? Is that going to be a self-service? Is it going to be the manager? Where's that coming from? Helps me to automate all of those. So that's a big portion of the user lifecycle management that we can automate. As you could see too, we have all those touch points into those target applications, so you can go through and automate that process. So when you're talking about, putting in or changing the roles inside of PeopleSoft Active Directory, once those approvals are done, we can perform those changes inside of the system automatically for you. One of the other things that is really a challenge, and this is the user access review. I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail and just kind of walk you through the process. So what I wanted to start with is when you look at what a review might consist of, I want you to think about what your process flow is. One of the questions that I frequently get is, can I group together my user access reviews from multiple systems? So tying in HCM and financials and Salesforce. I want to see what this user has or what all of my access is, from a manager's perspective. I don't want to have to do each one of these reviews individually. I just want to do my user access reviews, deal with the systems I need to deal with, get in and out and done. That's the nice part about this. So you can actually select the group of users, basically your population inside of this. What we call these are campaigns. So this campaign allows you to basically build out the group of users and applications that you want to look at. So we've got all sorts of different definitions on user groups, folder groups, all sorts of things like that. One, defining the elements for the review as well. What do I want to look at? Do I want to look at high risk groups? Am I looking at self-service users? You can define all of those types of things to make it to where this particular campaign consists of X users, and this is who I want to look at. Then which systems do I want to perform that across? And this is where we get into that cross system review to allow you to, perform this upon multiple different application sets. So it becomes a lot easier, one, because it's automated. Two, it's including just the group of users that you want to contain within this review, and it's going to perform that across the multiple different systems that you need within that review as well. So if you think about the workflow, the process, and then that's going to go out to the manager directly, and they can go in and automate the approval process. It becomes very easy from not having to think about it, because one of the next pieces is if you want to put in custom text in your emails or any of those types of things, you can do that as well. But then also there's saving and activating the process. How often am I going to run this? Is it going to be scheduled? Maybe I need to do my reviews once a month, or maybe it's every 3 months, every 4 months, every 6 months. Going back to some of the examples of some of the challenges that I've been asked about is high privilege users once a month. Great, schedule it. You need it in multiple systems. Great, put those in there. It's going to be completely automated. It's going to come to your inbox at the beginning of the month, and you're going to be able to go out in there and improve it and be done with it. You're not dealing with, oh, here's a spreadsheet with, 5,000 different line items in there, and you've got to go through and sort them and figure out which one goes to which particular user and all of those other types of things. No, it's not going to be that way. It comes in and allows you to, focus your time on the areas where it's needed. So that's really how you go in and define the campaign or the group of users that you're looking for. And you can see that's very customizable as to defining exactly what you want to look for. And then what does it look like from the manager's perspective? What do I get to see when I'm going through this user access review? So I'm going to go into the PeopleSoft, review roles process here of one of them that I've already run. So we're going to wait for that to load up here real quick. And we can see that we've got different users, different access. So I'm just going to pick somebody and click details here real quick. And what you can see is, I actually picked the guest account, but you can see what this user has access to. So here's all of the different roles, how much have they actually utilized. I can approve or deny that right there. So if I hit approve, I can save, it's done. I can make comments, I can do whatever I need on that particular process. If I hit reject, one of the things that that's going to do is it can go out and completely automate the process of removing that user's access there. It'll take away that role right away if you want to. It doesn't have to go to a security administrator who's then got to manually log in and track those changes on that spreadsheet. We can automate all that. Make it very streamlined, real efficient. If I want to drill in a little bit further to see what something consists of, I can click on the group or the role name. And when I open that up, all right, that one doesn't have anything, so I didn't grab a good one there. So let's look at the EOP user. Nope. So but normally what I grabbed one that didn't have any additional access underneath it. So let's see about this one here. We'll see if they've got anything. So normally what would display is, I'm going to go up and let's do this. I'm going to go back into review. Let's go back and I'm going to grab a different user here real quick. So let's just grab one here. and I'll grab one of the roles. So if I look at the absent manager fluid and drill into this, now there's actually an issue with this. So normally what would it would do is show me the pages and components that they actually have access to. So that's how you can drill in to see what that particular user has inside of that role. So we've got the role name and what activities are included in there, and so you can drill in and actually see if you need to pages and components that are being accessed with inside that particular permission list as well. So we go all the way down to that level. So, but once again, once those are approved or rejected, we handle all of that process flow right there. You get all of the automation, you get all of the auditing. So it becomes very easy because all of these are sourced out of one particular location. You can also see the review status as to where all of this sits. So if I go in and grab this, we can see where the review actually will sit, how many have been done, how many have not been done, who the manager is, how many different activities are within the particular roles that they're looking at, and those types of things. So it really allows you to have more detail and understand the process flow from the beginning. And then if you want to see the role or the status completely, it will just kind of show you all of the different authorizations that are out there, how many have been marked for removal, how many have been approved, how many are still not completed that still need to be performed. So this is really tying in. Going back up, you can see that we're tying all of this data into and around the SOD. So when we started talking about wrapping up the user lifecycle management, you have those SOD checks. Well, if you're building in those SOD checks into your user access reviews and your provisioning right away to where you understand if there's any sort of violation that might be assigned, it allows you to, one, clean those things up to begin with. So then your automation is much cleaner, much better, and it's not performing or causing more problems down the line. So that's one of the things that really helps when we're talking about the automation and the workflows is it's going to make your organization far more efficient but far more secure because those the reviews are going to be easier. The cleanup is happening right away at that particular point. And those joiner lever movers. So when we really think about that automation of the user lifecycle, and I'll go back to the PowerPoint here real quick. You can see if we go back to the life cycle that really is touching on all of the different points that we were talking about and communicating how many different challenges there are with. So when you have that role design and the access requests and everything's built into an automated system, it allows you better controls, access, and performance across your organization. So really when the benefits of automating user provisioning and deprovisioning, you saw some of them right there. One, it's ultimately going to cut down on your risk. Your goal is to protect your applications and all the data, whether it's in the cloud or on the premise. That's regardless of where your data sits, you want to protect your data. And you have to holistically think about it that way. So when you streamline those processes and there's something that's repeatable, the onboarding and the offboarding becomes very predictable. So it's going to help improve the productivity because now those windows of time become much shorter. Maybe it's hours or minutes that all of those processes go through. You can define the workflows. You can have an approval. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't an approval, depending upon the type of roles that this user is going to get. When you're looking at, this is what they're getting in 5 different applications. Let's approve that. Going back to that self-service example, bringing on a new employee that's, let's say, going to be working in the retail space or something like that. Bam. They don't really need a lot besides, self-service. When you look at it from higher ed students, majority of your, adding and, changing of access or bringing in new users all the time are going to be students. That can be easily automated. Here's all the access that they need. It's typically not high privileged because it's self-server use, self-service usage. So that's where you can streamline those processes to really take away a lot of the work. The other ones, when you're dealing with high privilege users, then you're adding in the correct workflows and approvers to be able to track those all the way through. So it's really a cost efficient usage of your IT and HCM resources or any of your approval resources, really, because that elimination of the manual processes is going to reduce the errors. Anytime you can automate it, there's going to be far less errors, and it's going to increase the consistency of what your users end up with, but it's also going to help you manage your risk effectively because there's less moving pieces, there's less that's done by a human. So that automation and the application of those roles in the user access reviews, for example, all of that helps to mitigate different challenges. So with that, I'll open it up for questions, and I'm going to throw it back to Stephanie for that. So if you do have any questions, just make sure that you enter them into the questions panel inside of the GoToWebinar control panel there.
Okay, thank you, Greg, for that presentation. And while we're waiting for a couple questions to come in, I have a few announcements to go over. Our next webinar for PeopleSoft will be on Tuesday, October 11th, and it will be PeopleSoft Role Management, Reduce Complexity, and Optimize for Compliance. And that will be at the same time at 1 p.m. Central Time. And then on October 19th, we'll have a webinar integrating small SSO and MFA for seamless and secure PeopleSoft authentication on October 19th at 1 p.m. Central Time. And okay, so our first question is, what is the implementation timeline?
The implementation timeline of this can be very rapid because it's external to the PeopleSoft system. What it does is we load the data in, so it's going to take data from within PeopleSoft. It's going to load all of the existing roles, permission lists, and what the authorizations that those users have. So you can start to immediately look at that and compare that to our delivered SOD rules. So it's going to start looking at some of the risks. So you can get some immediate information out of it nearly. Obviously, there's going to be additional rule validations and configurations based upon your environment itself as well. But the configuration and install and starting to get immediate benefit is really, really quick. So I would say, depending upon which pieces of functionality that you want to do, obviously the workflows are going to be constructed and things like that. So there's going to be a process flow inside of that. So, but when you start to talk about the SODs and some of the risks, you can get immediate usage of the system there while you're going through and configuring some of the other pieces as well.
Okay, great. One of the next questions that came in is, will it support MS Azure?
Yes, it will. So we frequently integrate with Azure, to go in and automate, the permissions inside of there. So it's something we see often.
Great. And then the next question is, what technical implementation effort is required?
So from a technical side, as I said, this is a third-party tool, that's communicating to your system. So there's obviously some installation configuration of those particular touch points. But at that particular point, it can come down to the resources that handle your security to be able to build the workflows. All of it is done on GUI pages, so the administration and the design of those are all relatively very easy to do. So it's really just building in your process flows as to what happens. So it doesn't have to be like a super high-end, administrator of the product, like a PeopleSoft administrator, those types of things. It's typically maybe a security admin or an analyst that's going to be working with some of your functional users just to define the workflows and the process flows.
Great. I think that's all the questions we have for today. I just wanted to thank everyone for attending. If you would like to attend our other webinar events, please follow us on LinkedIn. We announce it there, or join our email list. You'll get announcements for it there. And you can also reach out to us at info@pathlock.com. And with that, we hope to see you next time, and have a good afternoon.